So today we're going to be looking at part two of the consolidation and maintenance of power in Cuba. Some of the things that we're going to be looking at are some of the challenges that Castro faced. This chart is on your table, sorry, in your notes, and we are going to be going through some of these things in this chapter, but also in the next chapter when we get to it eventually. But let's get started. So obviously, the United States is not happy with what's happening, right? Castro knows that, and that's why the Cuban government at this time has this fear, this constant fear that the United States is going to have the CIA start a coup against them, just like how they had done in other parts of Latin America. So it's not like these fears are irrational. They're very rational because they see it. They see it happening. They saw it happening in Guatemala. They see it happening in other parts of Latin America, Central, South America. Um, but the thing is, when this revolution happened and Castro was in power and all these changes were being made, the United States was pretty calm at first in seeing what happened. Um, Not because they didn't care, but because they had to chill out, right? The CIA led a coup in Guatemala that painted a negative image on the United States, and Latin America was like, "F you guys" to the United States, and so this led to a lot of Latin American people thinking and feeling that they wanted to go the communist way because they did not like the United States and they felt that that was the answer to their issues. Um, and the United States was like, uh-oh, we can't do this anymore. At least we have to chill out for a little bit. So this shift in anti-American sentiment was also shown in 1958 when Vice President Nixon visited Venezuela, and you have all of these like this big crowd kicking his car, throwing rocks, basically yelling at him, as you can see in the pictures. The people in Latin America do not like the United States for the most part, and it was becoming very evident. But the United States brought that on themselves because of all the coups that they had implemented. Um, to install right-wing dictatorships. So the decision again was not to prevent Cuba from not to invade Cuba was not so much done out of the goodness of their heart, but more out of like their image not being tarnished even further. Next one. So dealing with the opposition of the revolution, uh, in the early years, you see three main groups: the Escambre rebels, which were loyalists to Batista, who wanted to continue to fight, and they did up until 1965. From 1960 to 65, they used very similar tactics to that of Castro, but they did not have the support of the peasants or the people, which is why they failed ultimately, even though they had the support of the CIA in the United States, and the mafia. Former members of the M26 and other anti-Batista groups who did not want to go in the communist direction, and some people were, being arrested and labeled as traitors. And then also, of course, the wealthy middle class who hoped that their interests would be protected, which is why you also see the middle class leaving Cuba, um, by the masses, because they wanted to make sure that their money was not being taken away. So they just like left with their money, before Castro could take it away from them and spread it. External groups also pose a threat. So we just looked at internal. External are people that are coming from outside of Cuba posing a threat, such as dictator Rafael Trujillo from the Dominican Republic was organizing a coup against Castro, funded by the CIA and advised by the CIA. Coup failed, of course, but this boosted Castro's image as a leader of fending off the aggressors and making sure that Cuba is safe. And it further sees him as the savior of Cuba and the U.S. as the enemy. Next one. The U.S. had so the U.S. can't implement a straight up war, not yet. So instead, they try to do this through economics. So when Castro nationalized the plantations and foreign businesses, the U.S. responded by banning all exports to Cuba, meaning U.S. companies in the United States were no longer allowed to sell to Cuba. Obviously, this hurt Cuba's economy because the United States was their biggest trade partner, especially since they're so freaking close. And Cuba relied on that. But Castro's not going to give up. And so what he does is Castro is forced to seek out another trading partner, the USSR. Um, Castro would have not have gone to the USSR if the United States had not placed that embargo, just letting you know. But that's what happened. So the Soviet leader Khrushchev took this opportunity to kind of build that relationship with Castro as an entryway to Latin America. Um, and this was the only alternative Castro had in doing that. So that's what happens. Next one. So the U.S. economic war continues. The USSR agreed to trade Cuba some oil in exchange for trading some sugar with them. So U.S. corporations that owned oil refineries in Cuba refused to process Soviet oil, and Castro's like, "Who do you think you are?" Kicks them out, nationalizes refineries, and this shocked the United States, angered U.S. companies because they were losing profits. They were losing profits on really good investments, and also angered the United States government in the fact that they had aligned themselves with their greatest global enemy. Um, the thing is, though, this revolution with Cuba saved the Cuban Revolution because, again, they had no other alternative. Soviet Union was helping them out financially with trading and all that stuff. Um, this only increased the intensity of the embargo. So the United States not only bans their own companies from being able to trade with Cuba, but they basically tell the entire world, do not trade with Cuba. And if you do, we're going to place that embargo on you. To this day, that still exists, just letting you know. So even if you're not a US company residing on US soil and your company's all the way in Italy, you have no beef with Cuba, right? Italy has no beef with Cuba. Don't matter. If Italy even tries to do some trading with Cuba, the United States places that same embargo or a similar embargo on Italy as well. Castro was like, F you, United States, accelerates his nationalization process of landing companies and kicks out even more US companies out of Cuba. And he accelerates the process of having universal healthcare and education in Cuba for all Cubans. Next slide. So that happens. And again, the CIA constantly on their mind, carrying terrorist attacks against Cuba, trying to destabilize the Cuban government. And so Castro's like, I need to defend myself, not himself, but as well as himself, but I need to defend Cuba. So the first step was to remove Cuban loyalists from basically the police force, the military force, all of that stuff. And if you were a loyalist, a Batista loyalist, who had previously committed heinous acts of like rape, murder, torture, all that stuff, you were executed. And they were letting everybody know we're not going to tolerate this. But basically, Castro created an armed militia at the same time to complement the existing army, to support the existing army, which came in a lot of, helped. Sorry, I'm like stuttering all over my in my brain, but it was very useful and very smart of Castro to do that, because if it were not for that creation of that militia, the Bay of Pigs maybe would have been successful. So the Bay of Pigs happens on April 1961. President Kennedy sends out about 1,400 troops, Cuban exiles, not U.S. troops, but Cuban exiles, Cubans who left Cuba as a protest against Castro. And so they're in the United States, and the United States military and CIA is training them, arming them, and basically telling them what to do in order to invade Cuba. The plan was to basically go into Cuba, spark a revolution, and kind of dethrone Castro and all of that stuff, right? They failed. But Castro engages with them in a fight, commanding a tank, leading his forces, and basically the radio's warning all of the people of Cuba, like, oh my God, they're here, they're trying to invade us. After 3 days of fighting, the Cuban exiles were defeated. About 118 of them were killed, and about 1,200 were arrested. On the Cuban side, though, they did take more casualties. About 4,000 civilians, militia, police officers, and a couple hundred military men were killed. 500 were wounded. The U.S. did not send their own troops. They could have sent U.S. Army troops, but they did not, because they didn't want to be accused of being involved in any of this. Because remember, they're trying to save their reputation from all the other stuff that they had been doing. But those who were the Cuban exiles, that were captured and arrested, they were paraded, as you can see in the bottom picture. They arrested them, they put handcuffs on them, and they made them walk through the neighborhoods and be like, this is who's trying to invade us. These are the traitors. And they're trying to support the United States by implementing a US backed regime again, right? And so the Cuban exiles who were arrested admitted to that. because that's the truth. Even the United States had to admit to that. This embarrassed the US because they no longer can claim the moral high ground of being the good country during the Cold War in this instance because of what they were trying to do. Castro's just trying to mind his own business with this country, and the United States is like, oh, let me send this invasion of Cuban exiles. Also, this proved Castro correct. Of he's no longer being seen as this like conspiracy theory type guy that's just way too paranoid, right? He was right. The United States did try to invade. He was right. Another issue was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. We're going to get into the Bay of Pigs and Cuban Missile Crisis again during the Cold War when we get to it senior year, but we're just covering it really quickly right now. Castro's main motivation for wanting to have missiles in Cuba is because he suspected the U.S. would attempt to invade again, and he wasn't actually wrong in that. In the sense that the United States government was constantly under pressure from Cuban exiles, US corporations, and the mafia to get rid of Castro. So Castro's idea was we have these missiles, the United States will not try to invade because we have these missiles. They'll leave us alone. It's a deterrent, right? So the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the United States places missiles in Italy and in Turkey very close to the proximity of the capital of the Soviet Union, which is Moscow, right? You can see it in the map. Turkey's right there. The Soviet Union is in the lighter shade. And so the Soviet Union sees this and they're like, what the F? Okay, if you're going to place something right in my own backyard, in the country next to me, I'm going to do the same thing too. So the USSR places missiles in Cuba as a response, and that sparks this big fear and this big conflict of the big bad, like Cubans and the USSR, and like, oh my God, are we going to have a nuclear holocaust, a nuclear war? What is going to happen, right? Um, it escalates, and it was so close to being nuclear war, but it didn't happen. Thankfully, thank God. Eventually, the USSR and the US come to an agreement that they would both remove their missiles from the areas in their from those areas, right? Turkey and Cuba, and the USSR made the United States promise that they would not invade Cuba. Of course, this angered Castro because he didn't believe that the US would keep their promise. But they did. The US did keep their promise, but not fully because they still were funding terrorists in Cuba, and they were plotting assassination attempts against Castro. Well over 100 of them, by the way. There was 100 assassination attempts on Castro. None of them succeeded. He actually ended up outliving all of these presidents who tried to have him assassinated, which is interesting. Last one. So military problems and solutions in to continue this last slide. Outside of this, Castro began to spread his anti-imperialist revolutionary to other parts of the world, like in Latin America and in Africa as well. So Cuba would send rebel troops to assist revolutionary movements, like in Angola, which is right there in that green country right there, southern western part of Africa, to help the left-wing movements, the MPLA, against the backed invasion forces by the United States. Che Guevara did the same thing. He was kind of bored of being in government of Cuba, and he's like, you know what, I'm just gonna go off and help all these other people. So he went to Congo, he went to Bolivia, and tried to help the movements there in crushing U.S.-backed forces and instead of helping left-wing movements. He was eventually assassinated in Bolivia by a CIA-led team. But yeah, that's it for this chapter. Thank you. Bye.